Ben Shernick, who is the director for the Nutrition and Food Security Alliance of Namibia. Ben, a very good morning to you, and thank you so much for making time out to join us.
Good morning. Thanks a lot for having us.
Well, just getting into this one, of course, we know that we're having the conversation under some somber times as well. Just reflect a little bit on how the news of the president's passing reached you, and what were some of your initial reactions to that news?
Well, I was at home on that morning with the kids, and I think one of the first thoughts was that it is sad also because he wouldn't be able to enjoy really looking back at his presidency and spending time with his family or just being on his own. And I think, as somebody recently said, like, just take a barefoot walk and soccer ball, travel at the beach, or travel the world, or just kind of look back and reflect and contribute in other ways, because I think it also puts a lot of pressure on a person to be in that seat. And I think it would be a great perspective to look back. I mean, he's looking back now from a very other perspective, from a soul perspective. But I think that's what I would have wished for him to
be able to witness and see what he has done. And he spoke about that often as well. I remember, I think, one of the last conversations also about just driving himself out of State House without all the security and all that. Like, I want to drive myself out here, and I don't want Namibians to say that I left with anything of theirs. that was his thinking. But coming from a social safety net perspective, of course, many refer to him as the president of the people. We know from a national budget perspective, about 40% of that, only second to, I think, operational expenditure, salaries and stuff, a lot of it was going to social safety nets. Just reflect on his outlook in as far as social welfare was concerned.
Well, I think he was one of the people who really, as Prime Minister or as Minister of Trade and other positions, who saw very early and very clearly that with those rates of poverty and hunger, it is really a huge concern for Namibians, but also for the state itself in terms of the security of the state and the prosperity and so forth. So I think this is why then, even as a minister back then, as a Minister of Trade and Industries, I think he was one of the first people to contribute to what was a pilot project at the time, the Basic Income Grant in Otjivero, to really say, look, this is one new innovative approach that I would like to support out of my own pocket. And then, of course, it also reflected in his policies, the food bank and other, I think the increase in the pension that almost doubled or overly doubled. And that really makes a huge impact on people's lives. So I think that is the part of the legacy that we need to continue to, as the previous guest also mentioned, to make it smarter, to make it more efficient, and to really make sure that it empowers people fully. So he was really one of the first people, to my knowledge, who saw that, and both in his professional but also in his personal capacity, pushed that agenda forward.
In terms of that, I mean, that thinking around the social protection and social safety net, I think, before we get into the details of the food bank and so forth, many argue and say, no, but we have to be very careful in terms of the amount of safety nets that we provide, because we might be encouraging lethargy, might be encouraging laziness. People might not, take initiative to go and fend for themselves under normal capitalist circumstances. Just talk to us about those two different schools of thought and why it's important for us to really bolster the social safety nets.
Well, I think the part of me that agrees with that statement is we shouldn't create too many complicated, difficult social safety nets that are difficult to maintain and cost much more in administration and oversight.
The actual support that comes with the people.
Exactly. So let's rather look at efficient models. So that is one. It is interesting that there are a number of studies that have shown how direct grants to people, in most cases, really are benefiting them. They're being put to good use and good use, and are really leading to people taking on new businesses, investing in their children, putting food on the table, and all of that. So there are several studies from Namibia, other African countries, and the world that provide evidence for that.
That social safety nets are indeed effective.
They are indeed effective, changing people's lives, improving people's lives, empowering people to really do something with their life and not just live from one bread to the other and try to think about where does this come from and being in an undernourished state. But there are no studies that I've seen, that I'm aware of, that show that people abuse money. So that's another very interesting phenomenon, that you have studies providing proof for the evidence that it works. And there's a lot of hearsay and maybe some anecdotal
counter-arguments are anecdotes and hearsay.
Yes, and of course, when things like the Basic Income Grant pilot project was introduced, there were accompanying measures to make sure, for instance, that shebeens or alcohol outlets are closed during payday and so forth. So it doesn't mean one needs to be blind to the reality on the ground in terms of the level of alcohol abuse in this country, or worldwide even. But it also needs to be reflected on that the pension grant makes a huge impact onto not just the elderly people's life, but their family's life and so forth. So I think there's also real evidence that those indirect payments to people through the pensions have really made a huge contribution to paying school fees, putting bread on the table and so forth. And of course there are small cases, numbers of cases where people misuse that.
But
the strong
you're saying, in terms of the actual evidence on the ground, there is support more for the social safety nets than the abuse thereof.
Exactly. Plus also in that context, because a lot of times alcohol is being mentioned as the number one
deterrent for improving that safety
exactly. Nets. And that is also just a symptom. I mean, it's a problem, but it's also a symptom of underlying psychosocial issues. So we need to also have many more social workers, psychologists, and so forth, or to tackle those underlying issues that lead people to go to alcohol as a strategy, which is a harmful strategy.
Because many young people argue and say, but what else am I going to do? I've got all this time at home, and the shebeen is right there down the street. So you're saying if we look at the underlying causes, if the young people are employed, if the people have things to do during the day, then it might also limit the negative consequences of the abuse that comes as a result.
Exactly. I mean, it's a multifaceted thing, so I think it would be really good to dive deeper into the issue of alcohol and why it's being used and what are the different factors contributing to it. But so far, in terms of social grants, there's clear evidence that it's being put for good use in most cases.
Let's look at the food bank, of course, coming into the picture there as well. And what made this unique as a social safety net intervention was that it was being done for peri-urban and urban areas. Generally, interventions for food bank and so forth, you would like to think that it's for rural areas that kind of intervention might be put into place. Let's reflect on some of the motivations and the reasons behind providing that sort of assistance at that level to individuals in urban and peri-urban areas.
Well, I think government has that distinction between what programs to use in what areas. So, for instance, the more rural areas fall under then drought relief, I think, and then the urban areas, and peri-urban areas, that's where the food bank applied. Yeah. And I think the thinking behind it was well intended in terms of making sure people have the basics, in terms of the food items, giving food directly. However, where I feel the shortcomings of these efforts were around the logistics and also the fact that food can also be converted into money, and we have heard cases of people selling the food and so forth. Plus you have this problem of a list of beneficiaries, and there were also a number of stories of people being put on the beneficiary list, although they didn't belong there.
They didn't go through the vetting process and so forth.
And so forth. So I think this is the problem that we have with conditional social safety nets, that you always have a huger amount of administration and so forth in it, and the vetting, but you also have a door open for corrupt practices. And this is the advantage of an unconditional grant, which basically goes to everybody according to certain qualifications. And even if you want to say, look, those who have a high income, you can still, through the Ministry of Finance and the tax brackets and so forth, put a control mechanisms into place there.
In terms of making the benefit progressive, depending on what your needs could be.
Exactly. Or you can say, look, if you pay tax at a certain amount, you do not qualify for this.
Because obviously, from the text, we can tell that you have got a certain livelihood or income that you can provide from there.
Exactly. Whereby more radically thinking, the unconditional one would go to everybody, and then you and I, who have a certain fixed income, maybe above that specific tax bracket, we can still pay it forward. Like there's nothing holding us back to donating these $500, $800, $1,000 monthly to a good purpose, because that's what it's intended for.
Was it effective though, the food bank?
The food bank, I would say it was effective for a lot of people that benefited from it? Was it efficient? Is another question.
That's another conversation altogether in terms of the efficiency.
But it did make a change. But I think there is also a reason why, even for the drought relief in the rural areas, government is now considering cash payouts and other modalities, because the money spent in logistics and so forth is also something that you can actually, make a more efficient process out of it.
Particularly also like looking at the food bank as well. I mean, you're saying that it was effective. There have been studies conducted in terms of its effectiveness. But the question generally is, if you look at particularly the conditional ones, it's usually tied to the administration. So this president feels, okay, we need a bit of increase here. Let's intervene here, etc. That's how the food bank came. What is the thinking right now from the side of civil society? Should government go ahead and find ways to make this permanent and bolster it? How does the future look like for the food bank from civil society perspective?
Yeah, so I can't speak for all of civil society, but I know there's a growing alliance within, or growing joint movement to really say we need to ensure that the social grants are A, increased, and B, increased in an efficient way, and there's an increased call for a universal basic income grant. Because if you look at the numbers with unemployment over 40, almost 50%, especially among the youth, the huge gap in terms of inequality, poverty, so you would actually really, even if you give it to every Namibian, you would reach the majority of the people, and you would have an impact on the majority of people's lives. And I think what is still not understood properly, and I think this is what civil society is trying to say, is the huge amount of impact it will have in terms of not just providing for people's basic living conditions, but to also in terms of job creation, in terms of empowerment. Because a lot of people do invest that into their own ways of making businesses or living or studies and so forth. So instead of designing complex mechanisms to think about what people would need in the job market and to create that, I mean, I'm not saying those programs should stop entirely, but I think the value of a basic income grant for everybody and the potential it kind of frees within people is completely, or is a lot of, it's undervalued. And that transformative process has been shown actually evidently in those pilot studies in Otsivero, but also in other countries. There is real evidence in pilot studies around the impact that such a grant has on communities.
We know that the support, the president made it very clear in terms of his support for the idea of the basic income grant, of course, by also being one of the first ones to donate out of pocket to the grant. But he had mentioned that maybe the strategy should be looked at, and one or two things should be reworked. What are some of those, loopholes or reworking or strategy that you feel he was referring to?
Well, I think in terms of the efficiency, that is really something that we need to look in. I think also there's certain monitoring, evaluation of the outcomes. And of course, you need to have some form of what we call accompanying measures, whether it's educational campaigns or it's the closing of shebeens at certain days, or to really pull through with that, or other areas that, and I think that hasn't fully been thought through yet. That is work in progress. And I think it also requires that boldness of really say, look, let's go for this. Let's be the first country to really do this, because we are the second most unequal country in the world. So this is our chance to actually shine on the world stage. And I think this is where, as much as the president, the office of the president is a very high office, the highest in the land. Yes. You do have not very limited, but you do have limited power.
Yeah.
So even with those intentions, he is limited as the president by so many other factors and processes.
Just
and
the bureaucracy, the administration that's required.
Exactly. So I think this is also, to his credit, must also be acknowledged, that there's only so much you can do, even within that highest office of the land.
And that much is true. That there's quite a limitation in terms of what can be achieved. But if one looks at the grant as well, particularly in terms of how it was being implemented, there is a bigger question around the issue of the nutritional value, and that even though it's a 250 that comes in, what can it afford to have that basic standard of the nutritional value that one needs for survival? Reflect a little bit on that, particularly with what we were providing at the food bank, and now moving, of course, to the big.
Yes. I think talking about nutritional value, I think I might have shared with you earlier. There was a recent study 2 years ago on the fill the nutrient gap that calculated it for a family of 5, father, mother, and 3 younger children, that with about 1,200 or 1,300 you could get the belly full in terms of the minimum kind of starch and other food to kind of just make it through the day. And you would need about, with inflation it's about 3,500 now, that you would need to have a minimal nutritious diet. And that means $3,500 for a family of 5 to be spent on food and just food items alone to meet the minimum nutritional requirements. So I think that is kind of what we need to keep in mind when we talk about how much money should we provide to
because giving money is one thing, but providing money that will be able to bring the required value is another altogether.
Exactly, and this is, I think, where you need to look at the whole complex system. So keeping that as a landmark in mind, and I think this also helps people to understand why it shouldn't just be the poor of the poor to receive that money, but even somebody who's working as a cashier at Pick n Pay or wherever, for 1,700, 1,600, whatever, that additional 500 or 800 will make a difference in that person's life. So this also needs to be taken into consideration when talking about a universal basic income grant for everybody. And the other aspect are those accompanying measures. So education around what is nutritious food, making food more available, growing local food, promoting indigenous foods. There is so much value in indigenous food, not just the mahango, but also different types of fruits, nuts, and beans, and so forth, that is still undervalued, not known. And I think this is where all of these aspects can come together, and government is doing a great job in enhancing the local food production. So all of this, I do have quite a positive outcome for the next 5 to 10 years if we are bold and if we go into that direction. And this is what I wished for the late president to have witnessed firsthand.
The fruits of that labor going forward.
Exactly, exactly.
Talking about this, of course, we know that the COVID was also one of those unexpected variables that came into play. Yeah. And we were under a chokehold for about 3 to 4 years, and obviously still trying to recover from that as well. But there was a bold intervention made of $750 Namibia indiscriminately, unconditionally, for everybody to benefit from.
Not everybody, though.
Not everybody. Yeah. Okay, let's reflect on that 750. Just the thinking during the time by the administration to say we need an intervention to sort of assist Namibians during this time.
Yep. I think that was a good example of a bold move within the limited frame that was doable at the time. And I think it showed 2 things. The one is that the 750 really made an impact. People didn't go out and drink it up or whatever, but people really spend it, and it made a difference in people's lives. But it also showed that around the circumstances of who qualifies, who doesn't, and so forth, it also created quite, it was amazing how fast it was moved.
And the disbursements actually happened so quickly after the announcement.
But it still came, if you look a bit behind the scenes, it came with a lot of efforts behind the scenes.
True.
And this is where, again, coming back to the efficiency, one could handle this process better, or I think this was something we need to have discussions about with civil society and government and the private sector, how we can really create a system that we can move very fast and that really targets every Namibian and really boosts the economy. I think it's not something that we need to think of as, oh, it's a social grant for the most needy and, oh, poor them, but to really say, look, we're investing in people because people are good, inherently good. I'm a social worker by profession, so it's my belief system, but it's also my experience that people need to be believed in and empowered. And it also flows back into the economy because it's not that we know what's best for people. People know what's best for them, and we can provide those accompanying measures in terms of education, in terms of strengthening food systems, and so forth.
And one of those things that really, and I know obviously initially our conversation, of course, is confined to food bank and social protection, but one can't leave some of these other efforts out. For example, the issue around the Solidarity Wealth Fund, for example, where the president says, I'm limited on the administrative level on the ground, But where I'm sitting from, perhaps this is the approach that we can take to say, how do we ensure that from our natural resources we are able to get enough on the side for our development programs as well? I reflect a little bit on that thinking, and I think the advent of the Solidarity World Fund and other interventions.
I think these are great creative thought processes to really see, look, what could be the sources of funding, because it is a huge funding investment. That will pay off eventually, but we do really need to have a sustainable mechanism to do that. So that is one option. Another option that we are proposing from the Nutrition and Food Security Alliance is a sugar tax, or it's mainly a tax on sugar-sweetened beverages, but it can be expanded even. And we have the sin tax already, I mean the one on alcohol and tobacco and so forth. So if you kind of create a system that you have different streams of income that somehow sends the message that, these are certain items that are not recommended, so we tax them more, and this gives us then the sufficient financial means to really boost the economy by means of a universal basic income.
In conclusion, Ben, what do you think is the legacy that I think in the final analysis that Dr. Hage Geingob leaves behind when it comes to social protection in Namibia?
I think really seeing and naming the fact that hunger and poverty is a real issue, and then taking bold steps, or the steps that he was able to take within the confines of his office or offices at the time, to support the pilot of the BIG, to support the food bank, to create the Ministry of Poverty Eradication, to put really Reverend yes, the minister in charge, Kameta.
Kameta, yes.
In charge of
yes, the first one.
Yes, the first one. To put him in charge, and to really kind of show that, look, this is something, if we want to really have prosperity in the Namibian house, this is what we need to focus on.
Thank you very much, Ben, for making time out to join us this morning.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having the conversation.
There we go. Bernd Schoeneck, of course, just the director for the Nutrition and Food Security Alliance of Namibia, speaking to us this morning around the food bank and what we can do, of course, to make sure that the Basic Income Grant program kicks off and is maintained. When we come back,